I want to start quietly, not with a story, not with an explanation, just a moment to arrive. There was a time in my life when I learned how to stay alert without knowing it, not in a dramatic way, more like a habit. You wake up, you move through the day, and somewhere in the background, there's this steady feeling that you're being measured, not out loud, not directly, just there. I didn't always have words for it. I only knew that being myself never felt complete. There was always something else I was supposed to do, something I hadn't reached yet, some version of me that might finally be enough. Maybe you know that feeling. Not the kind that comes with anger, but the kind that quietly shapes how you stand in a room. Do you recognize that tension of trying to be one step ahead of disappointment? Or that pause before you speak, wondering if what you are is already falling short? For a long time, I thought this was just how relationships worked. You show up, you try harder, you adjust, you keep moving, hoping the distance closes on its own. I didn't question it much. It felt familiar, almost normal. I'm not saying this was painful all the time. Most days, it was subtle, a small tightening in the chest, a habit of explaining myself when no one asked, a quiet urge to prove something, even in moments that didn't require proof. As I'm saying this now, I'm not looking for agreement. I'm just checking in. Does any part of this sound close to your experience? Have you ever felt like your value was always just slightly out of reach, even when you were doing your best? We don't need to answer that yet. There's no conclusion here. Just a shared pause, before we look more closely at where that feeling comes from. When I look back at that period, what stands out isn't a single argument or a clear breaking point. It's the length of it, the years, the repetition, a relationship that stayed tense without ever fully breaking, stretched thin but never released. I grew up with a father who was always present, but never easy to stand next to. He had strong opinions about how things should be done, how people should behave, what counted as respectable, what didn't. Approval was rare, silence was common, and disappointment didn't always come as words. It often showed up as a look or the absence of a response. Nothing about it felt dramatic at the time. It felt structured, predictable. I learned early where the line was, even though the line kept moving. What was acceptable one day could be dismissed the next. There was no clear rule book, just a sense that whatever I brought forward was probably not enough yet. So I kept trying. I worked harder. I focused more. I adjusted how I spoke, how I explained myself, how I stood in a room. I paid attention to timing, tone, results. Somewhere along the way, effort stopped being a choice and became a default setting. If something didn't land well, the answer was always the same: do more, do better, don't relax. I didn't think of this as seeking approval, at least not consciously. It felt closer to responsibility. Like this was simply what a son was supposed to do: meet expectations, rise to standards, earn acknowledgement through consistency. I assumed that if I stayed patient long enough, if I kept showing progress, something would shift. But it didn't. Conversations followed a familiar pattern. I would share what I was working on, what I had accomplished, what I was aiming toward. He would listen, sometimes carefully, sometimes with visible skepticism. The response rarely matched the effort behind it. A flaw would be pointed out, a risk emphasized, a comparison made, or the moment would pass without comment, as if nothing significant had been said. Then came the waiting. Not dramatic waiting, quiet waiting. Days where I replayed the interaction, wondering if I had said too much or not enough. Weeks where I stayed alert for a sign that something had landed. Months where I told myself the recognition might come later, after the next milestone, after the next improvement. It became a loop. Try, wait, feel the gap, start again. Over time, this rhythm settled into daily life. It didn't feel like conflict. It felt like pressure that never fully lifted. I learned how to function inside that pressure, how to keep moving without expecting relief, how to accept that satisfaction was provisional, temporary, and usually followed by a higher bar. What made it harder was that nothing was openly discussed. There was no clear rejection to react against, no final statement that said, "This will never happen." Just a steady absence of confirmation. A relationship where closeness was conditional and always slightly delayed. From the inside, it didn't look unusual. It looked like persistence, like discipline, like doing what was necessary. I didn't know the outcome. I didn't know where it was heading. I only knew that stopping didn't feel like an option, and slowing down felt risky. And so, inside that ongoing dynamic, life continued, one effort layered on top of another, without resolution, without clarity, and without the recognition I kept assuming would arrive eventually. Living inside that dynamic did something quiet to me. Not all at once, not in a way I could point to. It settled in slowly, like background noise you stop noticing but your body never does. Most days, I felt tired before anything had actually happened. Not physically, more like a low, constant drain. I would wake up already thinking about what still wasn't right, what still hadn't landed, what still needed to be improved. There was always something unfinished, even when I had done everything I knew how to do. I kept asking myself the same question, over and over, without realizing how often it came up. What am I missing? What part of this am I not getting? Where did I fall short this time? It wasn't loud self-doubt. It was practical, analytical. I treated my own worth like a problem to solve. If the response wasn't there, then something in me must still be incomplete. That idea felt reasonable at the time, almost responsible, but the longer it went on, the heavier it became. There were moments when effort started to feel disconnected from outcome. I could trace every step I took, every adjustment I made, and still not see a path forward. I would replay conversations in my head, not emotionally, but carefully tone, timing, wording, looking for the flaw that explained the distance. And when I couldn't find it, the uncertainty stayed. That's where the confusion lived, not in any single interaction, but in the pattern. I was moving constantly, but nothing was shifting. I was responding, adapting, improving, and yet the space between us remained exactly the same. No closer, no clearer. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel sad in a way that asked for comfort. What I felt was off balance, like pushing against something that didn't push back or move at all. It made it hard to trust my own sense of progress. There were days when I questioned whether I was even reading the situation correctly. Maybe I was expecting something unreasonable. Maybe this was normal. Maybe recognition wasn't something you waited for, it was something you earned endlessly, without acknowledgement. That thought didn't hurt. It just narrowed my world. I became more careful, more controlled. I measured myself constantly, even when no one else was watching. Relaxing felt risky. Letting go of effort felt like giving up ground I might never regain. At the same time, there was a quiet sense of losing orientation. If improvement didn't lead anywhere, then what was I actually moving toward? I didn't have an answer. I just knew that stopping wasn't an option I could consider. I carried that uncertainty with me, into work, into silence, into moments that should have felt complete but didn't. It wasn't dramatic suffering, it was endurance, a steady output of energy without feedback. As I'm describing this, I'm not asking you to feel sorry for me. I didn't feel sorry for myself then. I was just inside it, trying to function. And I wonder, as you listen, have you ever stayed in a pattern like that? Not because it was unbearable, but because it never clearly ended, where effort became automatic and doubt became part of the routine. That was the emotional landscape at the time. No clarity, no release, just ongoing motion, paired with the quiet sense that whatever I was giving, it still wasn't reaching the place it was meant to reach. Something changed, but not in a way that would have been easy to point out at the time. There was no clear moment where I stopped trying, no decision that felt firm or final. What happened was quieter than that. I noticed a pause. It came in between efforts. In the space after I had done what I usually did, adjusted, prepared, pushed a little more, and before I started again. For the first time, that space didn't immediately fill with the next plan. It stayed open a bit longer. In that pause, a thought surfaced that didn't sound dramatic or rebellious. It was almost practical. What if this doesn't change? Not as a complaint, not as a prediction, just as a possibility I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. Until then, everything I did was built on an assumption that recognition was delayed, not absent, that it was waiting somewhere ahead, tied to a future version of me that I hadn't reached yet. That belief kept me moving. It also kept me tense. Letting the other possibility exist even briefly shifted something. If recognition might never come, then effort no longer had a guaranteed destination, and that made the effort feel different. I didn't stop caring. I didn't suddenly feel free. What changed was the pressure behind the movement. The sense that everything depended on the next step loosened slightly, enough for me to notice how much force I had been using just to stay in place. Another question followed, slowly. Am I doing this because it matters to me, or because I'm still waiting to be seen? I didn't answer it right away. I wasn't trying to resolve it, I just let it sit there, alongside everything else. The question itself was new territory. It didn't demand action. It didn't accuse. It simply reframed the situation in a way I hadn't used before. That reframing didn't bring relief. It brought quiet. I became more aware of how often my attention was directed outward toward reaction, response, evaluation. How rarely I checked in with what felt sustainable. The effort was still there, but it no longer felt unquestionable. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't withdraw. From the outside, nothing changed. Inside, though, there was less urgency. The constant need to close the gap eased into something more measured. Not acceptance, exactly. More like acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that some distances aren't created by lack of effort. Acknowledgement that trying harder doesn't always alter the conditions. Acknowledgement that continuing doesn't require believing the outcome will change. That was the shift. Small, incomplete, still uncertain, but it allowed me to keep moving without tightening every time I did. To exist inside the situation without constantly bracing for judgment. I hadn't let go of the hope yet, but it no longer dictated every internal decision. The dynamic was still there. The pattern hadn't broken. What had changed was how much of myself I was using just to remain inside it. And for that moment, that was enough to continue. From where I stand now, the relationship looks different not because the past changed, but because I'm no longer inside it. What I see most clearly isn't the effort I made or the disappointment that followed, it's the structure of the dynamic itself, how consistent it was, how little room it left for mutual recognition, how everything flowed in one direction. At the time, I believed the distance meant I hadn't reached the right version of myself yet. That assumption shaped how I interpreted everything. Every silence felt like feedback. Every criticism felt instructional. I thought I was being evaluated, and that the evaluation could eventually turn favorable. Looking back, I can see that this belief kept me busy, but it also kept me from seeing the limits of the other person. Some people don't withhold recognition as a test. They withhold it because they don't have access to it. That doesn't make them villains. It doesn't make them monsters. It means their capacity is narrower than we want it to be, and no amount of effort on the receiving end expands that capacity. I didn't understand that then. I assumed recognition was something earned through persistence. Now I can see that, in this case, it wasn't a reward at the end of a process. It simply wasn't part of the system. This realization didn't come with relief or anger. It came with clarity. Clarity that the lack of acknowledgement wasn't evidence of my inadequacy. Clarity that the standards kept shifting because they were never meant to be met. Clarity that the relationship operated on control and evaluation, not mutual seeing. Understanding that changed how I hold the memory. It removed the constant question of, what if I had done more? There's no pride in that, and no resentment either, just a recognition that the outcome wasn't tied to performance. I also don't frame this as forgiveness. That word carries expectations I don't relate to. I didn't need to absolve anything. What I needed was distance, internal distance from the idea that someone else's inability to acknowledge me defined my position. That distance didn't require confrontation. It didn't require agreement. It didn't even require closure in the traditional sense. It required separating two things that had been fused together for too long: my value and someone else's judgment. Once those two were no longer bound, the past became easier to look at without distortion. I can acknowledge the pressure without turning it into proof of strength. I can acknowledge the endurance without celebrating it. I can name the harm without centering my identity around it. That balance matters. There's a temptation, when reflecting on experiences like this, to extract meaning by turning pain into purpose. I don't do that here. The experience wasn't special because it was difficult. It was simply formative. It shaped patterns I had to unlearn later, and that's as far as the significance goes. I also don't pretend that understanding someone's limits makes those limits harmless. The impact was real. The tension, the self-surveillance, the constant recalibration, those things left traces. Seeing them clearly doesn't erase them. It just stops them from being misunderstood. From this perspective, I can see how easy it is to internalize absence as failure, especially in relationships where authority and closeness are intertwined. When approval is rare, it becomes valuable. When it's valuable, we chase it. And when we chase it long enough, we forget to ask whether it's actually available. You don't notice this while it's happening. You notice it later when you're no longer negotiating for space in the same way. Now, when I think about that relationship, I don't feel the need to defend myself against it. I also don't feel the need to correct it. The dynamic existed. It shaped me, and it ended up teaching me something indirect, but important. That recognition, given sparingly, often says more about the giver than the one waiting for it. This isn't a conclusion I arrived at quickly. It took time, distance, and repetition in other contexts to recognize the pattern. But once I did, it stayed stable. It didn't fluctuate with mood or memory. I can hold the past without tightening around it. And from that steadier place, the value I assign to myself no longer rises or falls based on whether someone else ever learned how to offer what they themselves didn't know how to give. After living through that kind of dynamic, there are a few things I've come to understand, not as rules, not as answers, just as observations that settled over time. One of them is this: the feeling of being not enough often survives long after the relationship that created it. It doesn't stay attached to one person. It moves quietly into other spaces, work, friendships, even moments that are otherwise stable. And when it shows up, it can feel personal, like evidence, like something about you keeps falling short. What I've learned is that this feeling doesn't always belong to the person carrying it. In my case, the sense of insufficiency wasn't the result of a clear failure. It grew in an environment where recognition was inconsistent and conditional. Over time, that environment trained my attention outward. I learned to measure myself by response instead of by reality, by reaction instead of by substance. Understanding that didn't make the feeling disappear, but it changed how seriously I took it. There's a difference between listening to self-doubt and obeying it. For a long time, I treated every internal question as a directive, something that required fixing, improving, correcting. Now, I see those questions more as echoes. They tell me where I've been shaped, not necessarily where I'm lacking. If you carry a similar sense of still not enough, it doesn't automatically mean you've misjudged yourself. Sometimes it means you spent a long time in a place where enough was never clearly defined or never genuinely offered. I'm careful when I say that, because I'm not trying to reframe anyone's past or explain it away. I'm just naming a possibility that wasn't available to me for a long time. Another thing I've noticed is how easily we confuse endurance with obligation. Just because you've been strong inside a pattern doesn't mean you're required to keep proving that strength. Just because you've adapted well doesn't mean the conditions were fair or sustainable. That doesn't point to a single next step. It doesn't demand distance or confrontation or reconciliation. It simply invites a different way of holding yourself inside whatever choice you're already making. For me, separating my value from the approval I never received didn't require rewriting history. It required letting go of the idea that resolution had to come from the same place the tension began. Once I stopped expecting recognition from someone who wasn't able to give it, the absence lost some of its authority. Not all of it, but enough. I want to be clear here. I'm not offering this as a solution. I don't know what's right for your relationships or your boundaries. I'm only sharing what became steadier for me after a long period of confusion. If there's one thing I trust now, it's that feeling unseen doesn't invalidate what you've lived or who you are. It describes a gap, not a deficit, and gaps can exist without being your responsibility to close. You don't owe clarity to anyone else about how you measure yourself. You don't owe consistency in a system that never offered it back. And you don't owe an explanation for choosing what allows you to stay intact. Whatever you decide to do with these reflections, whether you keep them, set them aside, or question them, that choice remains yours. I'm not here to guide it. I'm just naming what became true for me, after a long time of mistaking silence for judgment and effort for worth. Sometimes, recognizing that distinction is enough to loosen the grip of a feeling that's been carried for years. Not because it disappears, but because it no longer gets to decide everything on its own. Before we end, I want to slow things down again. Thank you for staying with this. I know this wasn't a light story to sit with. It touches places, Many people learn to carry quietly, without ever naming them out loud. The fact that you listened all the way through matters, not as a favor to me, but as time you chose to give to yourself. There are experiences in life that don't resolve cleanly, relationships that never arrive at the understanding we once waited for, words that are never spoken, recognition that never takes shape. Those things don't always change, no matter how much time passes. What can change is how we hold them, not by rewriting the past, not by forcing meaning into it, just by allowing the weight to settle differently, by carrying it without letting it lean into every decision, every measure of self, every quiet moment of doubt. I don't believe standing steady means being unaffected. It means being honest about what stays, and still choosing how much space it gets inside you. Some memories don't need to be solved. They just need to be placed where they no longer crowd everything else. As you leave this space, there's nothing to take with you unless you want to. No conclusion you need to agree with. No feeling you're expected to hold on to. What stays? Stays because it feels true to you, not because it was offered here. I appreciate you for listening, for giving this time its full shape, and for trusting yourself enough to sit with something unfinished. That, on its own, is a quiet form of steadiness. Thank you for being here,